Hi, everyone. My name is Christina. I'm one of the senior genealogy librarians here at the Genealogy Center. And today I'm going to be discussing the full text search on FamilySearch that uses AI to read the records. Almost all of the records that you're going to see today are ones that I've pulled from FamilySearch using AI. There might be a few that I got from elsewhere, and I'll point those out when I do. For those who aren't familiar with the full text search on FamilySearch, this was something they actually launched last March after the 2024 Roots Tech Conference. And it uses handwriting recognition and OCR to search the records. And so when you're using this special full text feature, it's going to pull records that wouldn't normally show up in a normal search on FamilySearch if you just went to search and just went from there. And it's going to be pulling unindexed records, which has really been a really great resource because there's so many records on FamilySearch that haven't been indexed yet by them. So it's pulling up so much more than you normally would get. And it covers just over 4,500 collections from around the world. And the US collections, the big ones that they're pulling from are records such as land and probate records, court records, vital records. So it's a lot of those kind of records that you would be looking for whenever you can't find your normal birth, death, marriage records. These are kind of the records you turn to fill in those blanks. And that's what this full text search is really great for. So to just kind of show you guys how to get to it if you're not familiar with it. So when you log onto your home page, so when you're on your home page, you're going to scroll down. And you do have to scroll down a little bit, and it's going to be here at the bottom on the right side, FamilySearch Labs. You're going to click View Experiments. And they've added some new ones on in the last month or so since Root Tech has happened. And you're going to look for Expand Your Search with Full Text. So the first time you come to this page, it's going to have this blue button right here that says Try It. So you're going to click on that. And it'll bring you here to the main search page. Over here, you can find a collection. So if you're looking for something specific, you can search down there. I usually just start over here, and you can fill in what you're looking for either in keywords or you can do name. I usually just do keywords, and it seems to bring up everything just fine. So to start, we'll look for one of our ancestors here. And so the results are all going to be over here to the left. There are options to be able to filter what you're looking at. I usually start with place because I'm usually looking for someone in a specific area. So you can narrow it down by country, and then you can go state, and then county, and then sometimes you can even narrow it down by city. I usually stick with just county just because you don't know whether or not they're actually going to be within the town or the city or not. So once you do that, it's going to bring up just the records for the specific county you're looking for. If you're looking for someone in a specific time period, you can narrow it down that way. So you can choose one of these, and then you can even narrow it down even further by the decade. And that can be really useful if you're looking for a specific record from a specific time period or a specific year. There's also the option over here under search where you can do year, and so you can type in year range. However, that is going to, in my experience, that seems to bring up the year range if it falls within like what's in the title. So this, like this, for example, this 1813 to 1931. So it's not going to just bring up from that specific year. It's just going to find things that are within the date range. You can also do place over here if you don't want to use these little buttons over here. If you're looking for a record and you want to find another person with that record, I find it's useful to add them to names. So if I'm looking for Virginia Westerfield and her husband James, type in the name of the person we're looking for, and then the name of someone else. And now it's going to be looking for records where it has that first name up there, and then if it has that second name down there as well. And you can narrow it down that way. And you can also choose record type if you're looking for a specific record type. So if you're looking for a vital record, you can look over there. If you're looking for legal records, that would be things like probate records or deeds. You can narrow it down that way as well. Let me go back. So some tips for searching FamilySearch. I always put quotation marks around the names that I'm looking for. That way you're not getting like everyone with that one name and then everyone with that surname. It's just going to get the results that have those two names together. You also have to try every variation of spelling that you can think of and every nickname, misspellings, using initials instead of full names, just every variation of a person's name that you can think of whenever you're searching. And then, as I said, narrowing down the time period to a decade can be really useful, especially I find if you're looking for something like probate records and you know when they died, you can narrow it down to that decade to try and find those. And then looking at neighboring counties, if they're not showing up in a specific county, sometimes looking in neighboring counties to see if maybe they lived on the borderline, or maybe they were in one county and then it became another, and so those records are in that county now, or just doing a general state search. If you're not sure where in the state that they lived at, or you can just search the whole state instead of narrowing it down by county. So today I'm going to be talking about my fourth great-grandmother, Virginia Frances Settle. She was born in a little town called Rocky Hill in Barron County, Kentucky. This is a couple miles southwest, I believe, of Glasgow in Barron County. It's in the south central part of Kentucky. She was the oldest child of Franklin Settle and his second wife, Susan B. Holman, who survived infancy. There are some Bible records for the family that have been transcribed that I've found in some periodicals that give the birth dates, and it does appear there were several other children who died in infancy. And she had only two younger siblings that also survived to adulthood. Franklin Jr., born 1842, and Calpurnia, born 1843. So Virginia was married three times. First to Dr. James A. Westerfield. Second is to Dr. David P. Barclay, and then third was to Captain Thomas G. Page. And she had one daughter, Ella, who later went by Lala, Franklin Westerfield Barclay, and she was born in 1853. And then she and her second husband appear to have had an infant son. It's unclear if the son was born in 1855 or if he was born in 1856, but he did appear to die as an infant. One thing to keep in mind about Virginia and her family is that her family was a very prominent family in the area at the time. Her father, Franklin Settle, was the son of William Settle and Elizabeth Huffman. This family came to Barron County around the time Franklin was born from Virginia. And William was a blacksmith. He actually died very young in a smallpox epidemic in 1808. But his sons also became blacksmiths, and they created a rifle that was very popular at the time. And they were also merchants. They had several stores. And so they were a very large family. They were very wealthy. Everyone in the area knew who they were, and they were very well liked. And they were also enslavers. A lot of the records that I found were actually them selling enslaved people, or they show up a lot in a lot of their probate records. They were a well-liked family in the area, and that is something to keep in mind, especially as we talk about Virginia and her first husband. When doing the research on this family, I actually found most of the vital records for them. So I had all of the data, I had birth dates, marriage dates, death dates, I know where they're all buried because they're all buried in the family cemetery next to the old family house down in Barron County. But there were some questions that I had, such as what happened between Virginia and her first husband, James. He did not die. They clearly divorced because he went on to remarry and lived longer. So I was curious about what happened with that. Her daughter, Ella/Lala, she never shows up really under her biological father's surname, Westerfield. She always shows up as Barclay in all of the records, and so I was curious about that as well. The family was very affected by the Civil War, as we'll find out later. And then she and her third husband in the 1900 census are actually living in separate households. And they would have been married for about 30 years by that point. So I was wondering, why are they living in separate households? And then the last question I had is she and her daughter, Lala, they don't seem to like their Lala's daughter-in-law, Carrie Bell, and Carrie Bell's family very much. And so I was hoping to try and find some records to clear up and try and figure out what was going on with them. So Virginia and her first husband, James, married in May 1851 in Sumner County, Tennessee, which is right across the Kentucky-Tennessee border. The fact that they got married in Tennessee probably meant that her parents disapproved of the marriage. Since she was born in September, she would not have been 21 yet, so she had to have one of her parents sign off if she got married in Kentucky. And if they were not willing to do so, that's why they would have had to go to Tennessee to get married. And James was the eldest son of Dr. Isaac Westerfield, who was a doctor in the area, comes from an older Kentucky family as well, from like the Harrodsburg area. And their daughter Lala was born August 29th, 1853, so about 2 years after they married. They did not stay married for very long. The divorce records for them start in February of 1854. And when I was first looking for these records, I did find the circuit court order books that, listed the divorces, the filing of the paperwork and all of that. And I found those by searching the index for each of the circuit court order books. These were not something that just showed up in a normal search, and this was before full text. And so I was able to kind of get an idea of the timeline of, okay, this is when they filed the paperwork. She filed her own cross bill. I found a record that said she was filing depositions, but I didn't get a whole lot of information from the circuit court record books. And then there was a final judgment that was in the circuit court order book where Virginia was granted a full divorce. She was restored to all the rights and privileges of an unmarried woman. I'm not sure what rights and privileges an unmarried woman had over being married, but she got them back. And also, what I found particularly interesting is that it looks like James was essentially stripped of his parental rights. He was perpetually enjoined from taking Ella from Virginia's custody or from interfering in her raising of Ella, so he couldn't take her away. She had to stay with her mother. And reading that kind of brought up even more questions of what exactly happened to where this man was no longer allowed to, be in charge of his daughter's care, and for Virginia to be granted the full divorce. They did not restore her to her maiden name as she asked, but she basically got the full divorce she wanted, and James also had to pay all of her legal fees as well. So he had to cover his legal fees and hers. So clearly something went down between them, and it did not go well for James. So once the full text became available on FamilySearch, one of the first things I did was search to try and find these divorce records. And I did end up finding all of the depositions that Virginia had filed in her defense using the full text. They were under something called the Barron County Court Records, 1813 to 1931. And they were filed under this equity judgments with general index. So in Kentucky during this time period, divorces were filed in the circuit court and they were filed under chancery. And so the equity judgments go with the chancery courts, which are not something that I would have ever thought to look through to try and find divorce records. And these records are unindexed on FamilySearch. And there's a general index, but it gives you a bundle number. So you have to find the year and then go through that bundle number and then find your records within a whole bunch of other records. So without full text, I probably would have never found these records because it's something where I would have had to go through page by page, probably hundreds of records. As I said, James filed his complaint in February of 1854. And basically, to sum up what he was saying, he's saying that he was a physician and he wanted to try and find a place to work. And he decided he wanted to move to Campbellsville in Taylor County, Kentucky, which would have been several hours, if not a full day's ride at that time from Barron County, where they lived. And that Virginia was refusing to go with him, and that her refusal to go with them led to her abandoning him, and that he was wanting to be divorced because he had no hope for happiness ever again if he was not granted a divorce from this woman he claims abandoned him. And Virginia responded by filing a cross bill, and in her cross bill she says that he abandoned her and that they had been living separately for about a year before James filed his suit. So, given that time period, they were separated even when their daughter was born. So, they must have separated before she was born. She also states that at one point, after they were married, they moved up to Boone County, Kentucky, which is in northern Kentucky, near Cincinnati area. And then they moved back to Barron County and they boarded with someone named H.P. Gillock before they ended up moving back to her father's home at Rocky Hill. And that her father did try to help him out. He tried to give them a house and help him get set up in the area so that way he would stay in the area and Virginia would be able to stay near her family. But that James refused, and then James went off to Campbellsville, and that he sent for his clothes, but he never sent for her. And she also stated that their daughter, Ella, was about 2 and that she seems to have been sickly, required a lot of attention, and so she wanted to stay near her family and stay with her daughter to help take care of her daughter. And her parents were willing to help to support her and help take care of her daughter as well. And so she was asking for a full divorce from James, saying that he had abandoned her. So, as I said, Virginia had mentioned that they moved up to Boone County, Kentucky. Doing a little more research, it shows that James's parents were that's where they were married. And it actually looks like his mother's family was still up in the area at that time, so that may have been why they went up to Boone County. She also states that he went to Campbellsville alone. So, using the full text search, I just did a search for Westerfield in Taylor County and I narrowed it down to the 1850s just to see what would show up. And I found the 1853 tax list where you can see where the green arrow is. That's James. He's living there by himself in Campbellsville. So he was around long enough in the area to be put onto the tax list. So, as I said, the divorce is essentially boiled down to a he said, she said situation. James claims Virginia was refusing to ever leave Rocky Hill and was refusing to support his career. And Virginia was saying that James abandoned her because she did not want to leave her family in Rocky Hill. And so she and her lawyers began going around the community and gathering depositions from their neighbors and friends. One thing that was very interesting was that her mother's deposition, the questions for them were marked out. That's the record you see on this page where you see all the lines marked out. Those were actually the questions that would have been asked of her mother, but for some reason they took them out and they never asked them, and her mother was never deposed. And that is because I think her mother was the root of the problem between Virginia and James, or one of the causes. James did not like Susan, Virginia's mother. This may be why they went to Tennessee to get married, was because of this animosity between the two of them. And it may have been why James did not want to stay in the area, is because he did not like her mother and he believed that her mother was trying to turn Virginia against him. In some of the depositions, this is mentioned. There was one incident that happened at the house where he was angry with Virginia, and he said you had to get counsel from your mother before you can give me an answer. And this is in regards to him trying to convince her to leave Barron County and Rocky Hill and move to Taylor County. From another deposition, someone heard him saying that she was with bad advisors, alluding to her mother. He did not appear to ever have any issues with her father. He seemed to actually like her father, but again, he is claiming that her mother is giving her bad advice, and that bad advice is for her to not leave with James. And then The most damning one of all is that he said she was so much like her damned old mother that he could not get along with her in peace. This is what he told the owner of the boarding house where they lived at, where they were actually asked to leave the boarding house because of their issues with each other, was affecting the whole household. And he told him that they weren't ever going to be able to get along with each other. So clearly, some issues going on between James and his mother in law. There's also the issue of why did he marry her in the first place if he didn't like her mother? So Franklin Settle, Virginia's father, did offer him a fully built house, and he offered him an enslaved woman because it was the 1850s if he would stay. The witness who discussed this offer also mentioned that James had a gambling problem. And James would have known how wealthy Virginia's family was before they were married, because again, everyone in the area knew who the Suttles were, and they knew how rich they were. And in fact, Westerfield told someone that if he had offered him more money and given him the title to the house so he could sell it whenever he wanted to, he might have been tempted to stay. So that kind of brings into the issue of, was James a gold digger? Was he trying to did he marry Virginia because he knew she was rich and her family was rich and had a lot of land? And was he trying to get some land that way? So that was one of the things that I found through these records. And again, all of the depositions that I found were in Virginia's favor. I didn't find any that said really anything nice at all about James. At this point, James was living with his parents and his siblings in Missouri. That could be why there were no depositions in his favor, as he wasn't actually physically present in the area at the time of the divorce. But these depositions, they don't James doesn't come off very well in them. He comes across as possessive, controlling. He was seemed to have been verbally abusive of Virginia. As I said before, he and Virginia were actually kicked out of the boarding house in Barron County where they lived because Virginia would stay up crying so loudly at night that everyone in the household would hear, and it kept them up. And so H.B. Gillock's family actually asked him to ask the couple to leave because they were disturbing them at night so much. And there was also an incident at Rocky Hill at her father's house where the deputy sheriff, Benjamin Dickey, was visiting with the family when James showed up, demanding Virginia give him an answer on whether or not she would go away with him. One of the witnesses said that he was driven to desperation and believed he was partially deranged. And then Virginia told the deputy sheriff that she was afraid to go talk to James because he was as live kill her then as not, which is very concerning. In the end, she did end up talking to James. He ended up staying the night because her father was able to calm him down. But in the morning, the deputy sheriff said that Virginia's mother at first asked him to stay as long as James was around, but then eventually told him he could leave. So clearly, Virginia was afraid of him, and it seems that her mother was afraid of him as well. And again, her mother and James did not get along. And this may be why it may be that her mother maybe saw this in James before Virginia did. So while James doesn't come off very well, Virginia's family comes off pretty well. The depositions show how close the family were, and this may have been because, of those losses of those infant children, but they were a very close-knit family. And Virginia appears to have been fully supported by her family, even though there was a stigma at the time surrounding divorce. It doesn't seem that anyone was telling her no. It doesn't seem like anyone was telling her she shouldn't do this or saying they wouldn't support her if she did this. They were very much supporting her and behind her decision to do this in every way, which is very unusual when you think about it. Again, the time period that you would have thought it would have been viewed negatively by them, but it wasn't. And her parents were very much willing to take her and her daughter in and care for them and provide for them however they needed to. And her daughter, as one witness was saying, the child is the pet of the family. So they were a very close-knit family. So in January of 1855, again, Virginia was granted a divorce from James and custody of their daughter. At the end of the depositions, there were some that were actually dated from April 1855, and both of these were regarding James's character and whether or not he should be raising a daughter. And this first deposition is from Robert Dean Maupin, who was I believe, a colonel during the War of 1812 and actually was in the state legislature representing Barron County. So he was a very, very prominent man in the community. And he says, I've been acquainted with James Westerfield from his boyhood. From his general habits and temperament, I do not believe him at all calculated to raise, educate, and form the morals of a young female child. I look upon him as a long, flimsy, desolate profligate, not calculated to set an example to a female confided to his care, whether old or young. And this other deposition is from James W. Gorham, who was actually his lawyer from the divorce, because his lawyers were Gorin and Lewis. James W. Gorin was the Gorin of Lewis. There was no one else that it could be. So this was his former lawyer, or his lawyer that he had asked to represent him during his divorce. And he's saying he's known James for more than 11 years, which is probably why James asked him to be his lawyer. And that Gorin believes that from his knowledge of his habits, temperament, and social qualities, I do not believe that he is any respect qualified to educate and control a female child. He is tyrannical, malignant, and suspicious to the very last degree. To sum it up in a few words, he possesses less of the qualities of a gentleman than any man I know. I do not think he has any affection in the least. So clearly, they did not believe James should have custody of his daughter, and this may be why he was perpetually enjoined from interfering in Virginia's raising of him. As far as I can tell, there was no more contact between Virginia, James, and Ella after this. As I said, at this point, James is in Missouri. He seemed to have made no effort to try and get his daughter to go to Missouri after this. Clearly, the depositions worked in Virginia's favor in giving her the full custody and keeping James from trying to take their daughter away. So, from these divorce records, I got some really good gossip, a really juicy tale to tell everybody about. But I also learned things like where Virginia and James lived after their marriage. It gave me a glimpse into personalities in daily life. It showed me the family dynamics between Virginia and her family and how close they were. And it also confirmed the family standing within their community, that she was able to get people of such high standing in the community to write these depositions for her. Says a lot about how the community viewed her family. And for those curious about what happened to James, he did remarry in 1861 in Missouri. He had 3 sons, only 2 survived to adulthood. They lived in Chicago before moving up to Vermont, where his second wife was from. And based on what I've been able to gather from newspaper articles, it kind of seems that James and his second wife may have lived separate lives. I don't think they officially divorced, but it kind of seemed like he went to go do his thing. She did her thing, and they just kind of met with each other every now and then. And he died sometime in the 1890s, but I haven't been able to confirm that yet. So after this, Virginia remarried. She married Dr. because she had a type, D.P. Barclay, and he does go by D.P. and pretty much every single record I've ever seen regarding him, so I'm just going to keep referring to him by his initials. They married in October 1855, and then in October 1860, he and Virginia filed to have her daughter's name officially or legally changed from Westerfield to Barclay. So this answers the question of why she is always going by Barclay in her records and not Westerfield. It's because her name was legally changed to her stepfather's name. In 1857, Virginia's father, Franklin, died. He died from congestion of the brain, which may have been a stroke. He seemed to have written his will a couple days before he died, so it's unclear if maybe he had a stroke and then lingered and maybe had another one, or maybe if he had meningitis or some sort of brain fever of some type, but he did hang around for a little bit. So the Barron County will books you can find on Ancestry and FamilySearch. However, I found it in the equity judgment records, which also has probate records. And the will in there is a little bit different from the final one that I found in the will book. In the equity judgment records, he mistakenly refers to his daughter Calpurnia as granddaughter, which I think is just purely a mistake, not trying to say anything, about parentage. And there's nothing about his granddaughter Ella. But in the final will, he gives his daughter Calpurnia a piano if she wants, which actually lends credence to another family story about one of the subtle daughters being angry about having to leave her boarding house or her boarding school during because of the Civil War, and that when Yankee soldiers came to the house to ransack it, they made her play the piano, so she played Yankee Doodle, which the Confederates used as kind of like an insult to the Yankees at the time. So clearly, there's a daughter in the household at the time who liked to play the piano. And then I actually found a newspaper record that stated that the Home Guard, which was the Union militia in Kentucky, did actually ransack their house in November of 1863. So that tied with this will where Calpurnia is getting the piano actually does kind of lend some credence to that family story. But back to the will, Franklin, the part that's missing from Franklin's will in the equity judgment records is the part where his granddaughter Ella is given $300 to be kept for her benefit and especially for her education. That'd be about roughly $10,000 in today's money. So I'm not really sure what happened between if maybe it just accidentally got left out of one version or maybe if it got added on later when it was being officially filed and who would have officially filed that. But that's just an interesting thing to note that just because I thought I had a record, I saw this other version of it that was slightly different. The other thing in Franklin's will that was of great interest was that he is saying that he's singling out Virginia over her siblings because she had a disability of her right hand. There's no mention of whether or not it was from birth or an accident, but this is why gives her he gives her more land than her siblings and he pays off all of her legal fees that she acquired during her divorce to James Westerfield. And this is because she may not have been able to physically, have a living of her own if she had to. The other thing is that his will is very business minded. He talks a lot. He kept very good accounts for everyone who used his store, including his family. And so in his will, he's like forgiving a lot of the debt that his family accrued at his store, which I'm not sure why he kept it in the first place. But he did keep track of everyone who bought anything from his store, even if they were his kids. But his other two children, Franklin and Calpurnia, were also granted money. He is especially setting aside money for their education, which is interesting that he is singling out that aspect. And because they were both under 21, they both had to have guardians named. Susan, their mother, was named Calpurnia's guardian, and then DP, Virginia's husband, was Franklin's guardian. And this may be just because as a male, Franklin would have had more legal issues to deal with than Calpurnia would have, and that's why he had a man appointed his guardian. So when the Civil War breaks out, DP and Franklin, and from what I can tell, almost literally every single other man in Rocky Hill enlisted in the Confederate Army in the Kentucky 6th Mounted Infantry, Company E, which would later become part of the Orphan Brigade. They were part of the Rocky Hill Mounted Guards. And so this left Virginia, her mother, her sister, and her daughter alone at Rocky Hill. She does have a half sister who's older and a brother-in-law who is also her mother's brother, so her uncle, that are living in the area. And Joseph Holman is around because he's in his late 50s at this time. So he is on a lot of the documents for the family at the time because they are still administrating Franklin's estate up to this point. So DP dies January 8th, 1862 in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And then her brother Franklin dies in 1863 at a private hospital in Georgia from typhoid fever. And then in December 1863, her mother dies. So this is leaving Virginia as a head of household. So we're now down to Virginia, her sister, and her daughter. And so she has to deal with the probate of all three of these estates because all three of them died intestate. None of them had wills. It's a little odd that her husband didn't have a will because a lot of men when the Civil War broke out, did write out quick wills before they went off or enlisted. Apparently, he didn't. So because there's no wills, this is going to make the administration and disbursement of their estates more difficult. When DP died, Franklin actually had to appoint a new guardian because he was still under 21 at the time, and DP was his guardian. And then Susan, their mother, was an heir of Franklin since he died before her. When they're administrating her part of the estate, they have to keep into account what she would have inherited from her son if she were still alive. Again, this just makes things more complicated, and it means that Virginia is having to reach out to any of her other male relatives or friends to help her with all of these legal issues. So this is an inventory of her brother's estate, and this is just in like the Barron County miscellaneous records. It's the enslaved people that his father left in his will, which this is why these type of records are what we tell people when they're doing African American research, to look for these probate and inventory records because you can find a lot of people in them. His estate is also promissory notes from various members of his family and the neighbors, and these were all most likely ones that he inherited from his father. And then DP's Barclay, first part of it is a lot of his medical tools, his textbooks, medical textbooks. He had some blacksmithing tools that he probably inherited from his father-in-law. There was about 4 or 5 more pages of just notes of who owed him money. And this is most likely because he was a doctor and traveling around. And I don't know if you can see, but next to some of the names, it says in parentheses doubtful. So they're basically saying we're probably not going to get this guy to pay the money he owes. So we're adding this on here, but we're not really going to be taking into account how much he owes him because he's not going to pay up, which I thought was really interesting that they would be noting that in there. The other interesting thing with DP's estate is that Virginia was not an heir to her husband because she was the widow. And in Kentucky, the widow receives a dower, which is 1/3 of the estate, not the full estate, and they're not considered legal heirs. They're just the widow, and they get the dower. And then because DP didn't legally adopt Ella as his daughter or name her as an heir in any sort of records, he was just her guardian. And so since he died without a will and no legally recognized heirs, his heirs were all of his siblings and then the children of siblings who had died. And so these records from the court order books that kind of show them hashing out how they're dealing with his estate. I was able to pull his siblings' names from there and then be able to build on his family tree from this. And this is the type of record, again, that would be used to confirm family relationships or to confirm parents. Doing collateral research when you can't find a record stating someone is a parent, if you can link them to siblings and then link the siblings to the parents. That's kind of how the collateral research works. And so that's what I was able to do, finding these estate records for DP. And then this is a sale bill from Susan's estate in 1864. And they had a surprising amount of livestock and crops and supplies going on, despite the fact that the war was going on and Kentucky was pretty much ravaged at this point. So that tells me that someone was around working on the farm, whether these were the formerly enslaved people who stayed around, or if these were maybe male relatives who were too old or too young that were working the farm. Someone was around taking care of these animals and raising these crops and harvesting them, because it probably wasn't Virginia and her sister. I don't know if you, again, if you can kind of see, this is a sale bill, so this would have been like at an auction. Mrs. Barclay and sister, Virginia and her sister essentially had to buy back a lot of the stuff. So a lot of the supplies that they would have needed, they would have had to buy back from their mother's estate. So after the war, Calpurnia marries Captain Thomas G. Page in 1867. They have 2 children, a daughter who dies in infancy and a son, Henry, who dies in 1887. And they live in the Settle household with Virginia and Ella. And Calpurnia died in October of 1870. And trying to search for Calpurnia in full text was difficult because of the spelling of her name. Usually when people have unusual names like this, that's someone you want to focus on just because it's easier to keep track of someone named Calpurnia versus someone named Mary. However, when you're doing the full text, there's just so many different variations of how this person's name could be spelled that it is actually a little bit more difficult. At some points, the AI was transcribing her name as California, not Calpurnia. She also went by Pernia or Perny, which could have been transcribed as Penny or Penia. So finding records for Calpurnia, in order to do so, I had to search by her husband's name or Virginia's name to try and find anything. And one thing that I was able to find was this record from the county court where Thomas Page is being appointed the guardian of his son Henry. So finding one of these is very unusual when it's a woman who's died. Usually I've seen if the father dies and the child is the orphan child and the mother is appointed guardian. This is actually the first time I've ever seen the father having to be appointed the guardian of their child because the mother has died. And this is probably because Calpurnia had so much land that she inherited from her father that he was being appointed guardian to to handle all of the legal stuff for his son regarding all of the property he would have inherited as the legal heir to his mother. And then the James G. Page is actually Thomas's father. So Virginia's daughter Ella marries George R. Page in 1868, and George is Thomas Page's brother. And at this point, Ella starts going by Lala instead of Ella in the records. I think this is probably more a pronunciation issue than anything, just you get that southern drawl, Ella, Lala. But she goes by variations of Lala from this point forward. She has one son, Garland, who was born in August 1868, which this is the date pulled from his headstone. So this means he was born several months before his parents were married. Lala and George divorce in 1866. George remarries, divorces his second wife, and then moves back to Rocky Hill before he dies in 1929. And Lala was also difficult to search for because of the spelling of her name. Sometimes there's an H, sometimes there's not. This is the Equity Judgment Docket Index that shows when she and George were divorced, and there's no H on there. But again, AI was pulling up her name as things like Gula, Gala. So searching for Lala in the records was difficult, just as it was with searching for Calpurnia. In 1871, Virginia marries her brother-in-law, Thomas Page. He was there. He was alive, which, given the Civil War, there wasn't a whole lot of other men she could have married at the time. She wasn't, biologically related to in the area. And their families were already legally connected because he was had been married to her sister, and because her daughter is married to his brother. And it does kind of hurt your head when you try and think of these relationships. So she married her brother-in-law and her daughter's brother-in-law. The tax records from 1871 show that Thomas was not only the guardian for his son, but before he married Virginia, he was kind of acting as an agent for Virginia. So he was already acting for Virginia on legal issues anyway, so that may have been why they got married. If he's doing that anyway, might as well get married. It doesn't last very long, though. In July of 1889, I found this deed, and this was a surprise to find when I did find it, where it says that on account of incompatibility of temper, the said Thomas Page and Virginia Page's wife is separated and determined to live apart. So basically, this is a deed just kind of settling their. It's acting as a divorce in a way. They're not legally getting divorced, but this deed is stating who's getting what and all of that without actually having to go through the whole divorce process. And this is probably because Virginia didn't want to have to do it again. It was probably very traumatic the first time, so she probably didn't want to have to do it a second time. But in this, Virginia agrees to never file for alimony or dower from Thomas. Thomas essentially gives her everything that he would have inherited from his wife. And he's releasing interest in claiming her land and is basically saying, I'm not going to try and take anything back from you. And he gets the profits from all of the crops that are harvested that year. And then he also has to pay her $50 on Christmas, which I didn't really find a reason why, but Merry Christmas, I guess. But they don't, as I said, they don't officially divorce. They do show up in later deeds together when they're selling land that they're still holding together as husband and wife. So clearly there's no legal official separation between them. And then this is why Thomas is living with his mother in the 1900 census, and then he's living with siblings in later census before he dies. So the last question that I had about this family is one that I still haven't quite figured out yet. And this is that Virginia and Lala's wills. They both wrote their wills on April 18th, 1903. And then on May 21st, Lala went and added a codicil, and it's stating that the family, mother, brothers, or sisters of Carrie Bell Page, her daughter-in-law, shall never receive, enjoy, or live at or upon any of the property that she's giving to her son, Garland. And that if her son Garland ever takes in any of the brothers, sisters, or mother of Carrie Bell, then he basically loses the house and the property and will become his children's property. So as I said, Lala added this codicil on May 21st, 1903, and Virginia added the codicil May 26th, 1903. So clearly something happened between the writing of the will and when this codicil happened to make them say, no, we don't want them anywhere near our house or property. And there are a couple of reasons that that could be. It could be that they wanted to make sure that this family land and this family house that they worked so hard to keep under their name stays in their direct line. They were probably very protective of their family unit, especially when you consider everything that happened through divorce and then what happened during the Civil War with everyone dying. They were probably unusually and maybe even unhealthily close to each other. And so an outsider coming in may have disrupted that. And they may have had some personal issues with Carrie Bell's family or her mother specifically. There may have been some issues with the estate of Carrie Bell's father, who had died in 1900. He seems to have died intestate, and he was also a rich, prominent man in the community, so he would have had a lot to administer. And there may have been something court ruling or something that happened in this time period that would have made it seem like Carrie Bell's family would have had to lean on her financially. Another possibility is that her father died of tuberculosis. She had a brother die of tuberculosis, and Carrie Bell herself actually died of tuberculosis in the 1930s. So it's possible that they were afraid of this disease because it was something that it was believed to have, run in families, and that I could catch it that way. So it may be that maybe they didn't want her family around because they thought they would all give everybody consumption or tuberculosis that way. And then there may be some other unknown reason. I think it's probably a mixture of something going on with Carrie Bell's father's estate and just the protectiveness of the family unit. And this is something that I would have to access probate records and deeds after 1900. Unfortunately, Barron County doesn't have those available on FamilySearch. So this is why I wasn't able to figure this out, but I think finding those records are probably going to help maybe not quite solve this mystery, but get a little bit closer to the answer. And Virginia died Halloween 1903, and she is buried in the Page Family Cemetery that's near what is now known as the Franklin Settle House at Rocky Hill, and the house is actually on the National Register. And there is this quote here from the owner of the boarding house that James said about Virginia, which is that she never would be satisfied to live anywhere but at Rocky Hill. So it seems appropriate that that's where she is still at today. So from doing all of this family research, I learned some more and new tricks about searching full text. So a result that shows up you might think it might be about one person, but when you go and click on it, it might actually be for someone else. So for example, when I was looking for her brother, Franklin B. or F.B. Settle, that's actually how I found D.P.'s Barclay. Barclay's inventory because Franklin, I guess, owed him some money and was on there. Middle initials can make a difference. Thomas G. Page always had the G. There's, I think, maybe one or two records I've seen of his where there is not a G. He always has a G. So I know I'll always have the right person because it's going to have that G in there. And some people do use those middle initials like that. Another tip is to do some research on which courts would have what type of records. Again, with the divorces being in the Chancery and Equity Court of the Circuit Court, that helped a lot in knowing kind of what I needed to be looking for. Keeping in mind that people's names change. They can change it a little bit, or it may change a lot, or they use nicknames. So Ella changed to Lala. Virginia often shows up as Ginny, and then her sister Calpurnia as Perny. So remembering to keep in mind to search those nicknames or slight variations of the names whenever I'm searching. Don't ignore documents you already have. They could be slightly different versions. Franklin Suttle's will, again, I have one from the will book and then the one that's in the equity judgment that is slightly different. And that could be significant or it could be just been an error, but I don't know. And it's interesting that what was added afterwards. Whenever you're looking at a result on full text, look at the pages before and after what you're looking at because there may be more to the record than just that one page you're looking at, or you may stumble across other records that you're looking for. And then another thing is don't assume that women aren't going to show up in anything. A lot of times I'll have patrons tell me when they're looking for probates, oh, well, she was a daughter, so she wouldn't have been mentioned in the father's will. Actually, she probably would have. I'm not saying that women had all the rights, but it wasn't entirely Pride and Prejudice. They do show up in the court records. They were included in probate records in their father's wills. So don't just assume that a woman is not going to show up in anything. Go ahead and search for her anyway in the court records and in probate records and all those sorts of things. So we can move on to the question portion now.
Somebody said that you need your own like storyline on PBS.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I think is a good like segue to a question somebody had actually just asked, which was you diligently searched and found a lot of documents about this family. Is this like normal amount of documents to be found?
I would say no. I think the reason they show up in so many documents is because they were wealthy. If you're just kind of standard middle class farmers, which I've got in my family as well, you'll find like your standard deeds and stuff, but you might not find as much. And the other thing is that all of these records have been put online and digitized. So that was helpful as well, because you're not always going to find all of these court records on FamilySearch in the first place. But again, I do think the fact that they were so wealthy is probably why I was able to find so many records.
Okay, so the next person was asking, the problem I am having with documents found with full text search on FamilySearch is that the citation provided does not include the actual title, what you're looking at. So for example, like what deed book it is.
Yeah.
Then you have to like kind of dig through it and sort it out. So she was wondering, am I missing something or is it really just not included?
It's not included in the citation. You do have to kind of go back until you can find the beginning of the book to get that. I wish that was something that they did, and maybe that's something that if everyone does the feedback on it, they'll add it to it. But for now, you just kind of have to try and get to the beginning of the record to find out, like the deed book number or the court book number to find it.
I think they are working on it though. So
Yeah.
stay tuned. So the next person was wondering, will the search eventually include variation? So like variant spellings just automatically.
I'm not sure. Maybe, I mean, as they train the AI to kind of go over more and more records, it's gonna learn more and more and get more accurate. So if they were to run the AI after like a year or two of doing it over so many different types of records and training for it, if they were to run it over these records again, it might pull up more accurate variations of the names or transcriptions of the names. That would be my guess.
Yeah, I was just looking to see like for like Charles Smith was like would Chaz show up?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not seeing that, so I'm gonna say not yet.
Mm-hmm.
So just be creative.
Yeah.
So the next question is just to clarify. You said at the beginning that all the stuff that you've shown us through this presentation, you found all of it through Family Search.
Yeah, I think there
Well,
was
through the AI.
yeah, there's the muster roll for Franklin Settle. Um Actually, I think you can find that in Family Search using the AI because I think those might be that I pulled from Fold 3. Um yeah, everything else is something that I got from Family Search and that would have showed up in the full text.
Cool.
And again, that's just because Barron County happens to have all of that on there.
Yeah,
And you may not be able to find that if your county doesn't have that on there.
right.
But
So as far as you building the case study
mhm,
using AI, it's just
mhm.
you just search and search and search and search to find stuff to build the story.
Yeah, I searched every variation. I searched all of her names. I used initials, just every variation I could possibly think of, and went through all of the results to see what showed up.
Cool. So we got time for two more questions. If we did not get to your question, please send us an email. Our email is genealogy@acpl.info, which I'm going to stick that in the chat. And if you'd like a copy of the chat, send us an email for that as well. For those who asked earlier, this program is being recorded and it will show up on our YouTube channel soon. So just want to get that out of the way. So second to last question. Do you have to repeat the search using different filters, or can you change do a search and then change the filters?
You can, like, if you just search a name and then you add the filters, and then there's an option to where you can just X out the filter you just applied. So if you were looking in Barron County and you decided, I just want to do a general state, you can go back to place and then exit out of the county that you're looking at, and then it'll just do that. So you don't have to do like a whole new search. You can just kind of exit out of the filters and add on the filters as you want to use them.
Cool. The last one, based on the case study you presented about the family who were enslavers, can you explain how full text search can be utilized to find references of enslaved individuals in their probate and land records? Like, what are some of the best practices for searching these type of documents in this specific context?
Mm. Um, as you say, if you know what their name would have been at the time, you can search that. And then if you knew where they were, you can narrow it down that way. Um, you can, let me see. One common misconception is that everyone who was formerly enslaved took their former enslavers' surnames as their own, and that's not true. Yes, people did, but not everyone did. So you can start out by searching for enslavers in the area with that surname. It is a place to start, and then see, are you finding someone with the same name matching up in the probate records at the time period, to search that. Um, to, so that's one way you can start to do that. Yeah,
One
and then
thing,
just
no, go ahead.
And then say you can also just add in like the slave or the keyword slave as well, and that would probably bring up those records as well.
Yeah, that's actually what I was about to mention. For me doing Louisiana research, the parish where my people were from, the records are in rough shape. But if I'm searching every version of slave and all the words that go along with it in English, Spanish, and French, I'll find more stuff. I'll find more stuff in French and Spanish than I will in English. So be creative.
Yeah. The other thing too is in Kentucky records, they always, always, always point out when someone is not white.
Yeah.
They always say what their race is when they're not white. And this is up to like the 1970s that they would do this in anything you find. And so that is awful, but it's also helpful when you're doing this type of research. So if you're finding the name and they're not pointing out that they're not white, usually it's going to be the phrase colored, some variation of that after the name. If it doesn't say that, then it might not be your person if you're looking for someone who's not white.
So we are just about out of time. Thank you, Christina, for such a awesome presentation and sharing a bit of your family story with us, which, the drama, I live for it.
Yeah, this was a family I always heard all of the family stories about as a kid.
Yeah.
So
Cool. So just as a reminder, if you have more questions, please send us an email. Our email is genealogy@acpl.info. I'm going to stick that in the chat again. Okay. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.